The whiskey burned a familiar path down my throat. Outside, the last of the evening light bled away, leaving the city a smear of orange and purple. Inside, there was just the hum of the old refrigerator, and the smell of a room that hadn't seen fresh air in a long time. The bottle was almost empty. Good. 1 year. Today. 12 months. 365 days since the sound of impact, the squeal of tires, the silence that followed. I took another swallow, the liquid fire doing little to warm the cold spot in the center of my chest. My eyes drifted to the wall. To the picture. It was from before. Before this room, before the whiskey, before the man in the mirror looked like a stranger. In the photo, a younger version of me was grinning, arms slung around a woman who was laughing into the sun. We were on a hiking trail somewhere, trees of vibrant green behind us. A different life. A different man. I squeezed my eyes shut, the memory of physical pressure behind them. When I opened them, something was off. The picture frame. It was crooked. Just a few degrees. The top right corner dipping down. I stared at it, the edges of my vision swimming slightly from the alcohol. It was probably me. I probably knocked it earlier and just didn't notice. I pushed myself up from the sagging armchair, my joints complaining. My feet felt clumsy on the wooden floor as I crossed the room. The floorboards didn't creak. They never did. I reached out, my fingers clumsy, and nudged the cheap black frame back into place. Perfectly level. I stood back for a moment, making sure. Yeah. Level. Drunk bastard. I muttered to the empty room. The sound of my own voice was rough, unused. I turned and shuffled toward the small kitchen alcove, my hand already reaching for a glass. A little water to chase the burn. The refrigerator gave a heavy sigh and fell silent, plunging the apartment into a deeper quiet. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic drip of the faucet I kept meaning to fix. 1 drip. 2 drips. 3. I filled the glass and was lifting it to my lips when I heard it. A soft click. It came from the main room. It was tiny, barely there, the kind of sound a house makes when it settles. But it was sharp. Precise. Not a creak or a groan. A click. I froze. The glass paused an inch from my mouth. My breathing stopped. I listened, every nerve ending suddenly on high alert. The drip from the faucet seemed impossibly loud in the new silence. Drip. Drip. Nothing else. The whiskey haze in my head evaporated, replaced by a sharp, unwelcome clarity. I set the glass down on the counter without a sound, and turned. My movements slow, deliberate. I stepped out of the kitchen alcove. My eyes went straight to the wall. The picture was tilted again. But it wasn't the same. This time, it was angled the other way. The top left corner was the one dipping down now. A cold wave washed over me, starting in my stomach and spreading outward, chasing away the last of the whiskey's warmth. No. That wasn't possible. I had just fixed it. I had watched it. I had made it straight. My feet carried me across the room, my earlier unsteadiness gone. I stood before the picture, my heart beginning a low, heavy drumming against my ribs. I reached out a trembling hand, not to fix it, but to inspect it. My fingers traced the edge of the frame. I pressed it against the wall. Solid. I hooked a finger behind it, trying to feel the nail it was hanging on. It was snug, firmly in place. There was no looseness, no wobble. It could not have shifted on its own. It certainly couldn't have shifted in the opposite direction. What the hell? The words were a whisper. The air in the room felt thick, heavy. The 4 walls seemed to be pressing in. I needed to get out. That was the only thought that made sense. Get out. Get some air. Walk. Just walk until my head was clear. I turned and went for the front door, my pace quickening with each step. My hand closed around the old brass knob. It felt cold against my sweaty palm. I turned it. Nothing. It didn't budge. I frowned, and tried again, putting more force into it. The knob turned, but the latch didn't retract. It felt like turning a key in the wrong lock. I rattled it, a frantic, jangling sound that seemed alien in the apartment. Still nothing. I put my shoulder against the wood and pushed. Hard. My feet slipped on the floorboards. The door didn't move an inch. It was as if the other side was a solid wall of concrete. The frame and the door now one single, immovable object. Panic, cold and sharp, jabbed at my lungs. I backed away, fumbling in my pocket for my phone. My thumb swiped across the screen, the bright light making me squint. I tapped the phone icon. And froze. In the top left corner of the screen, where the signal bars should have been, was a single, stark message. No service. Impossible. I always had service here. Always. I scrambled to the window, peering through the grimy glass. Across the small alley, I could see into my neighbor's apartment. I could see the little green light on his internet router, blinking steadily. He had a connection. The cell tower was working. The problem wasn't the tower. The problem was here. Inside. Son of a bitch. I breathed the words, a cloud of mist appearing on the cold glass. I stared at my own reflection, a pale, wide-eyed ghost. It locked me in. I backed away from the window, away from the door. My eyes darted around the room, which suddenly felt less like a home and more like a cage. The armchair. The table with the empty bottle. The picture on the wall, still stubbornly, impossibly crooked. The room was watching me. I could feel it. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild drumbeat of terror. And then I heard the sound. It started from the front door. A low, splintering noise. Scree. It was the sound of something sharp being dragged slowly across wood. But it wasn't coming from the outside. The sound was muffled, thick, as if it was coming from inside the door itself, somewhere between the inner and outer layers of timber. As if something was clawing its way through the very wood that blocked my escape. My blood ran cold. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Instinct took over. My eyes scanned the room for a weapon, for anything. They landed on the corner, behind a stack of old newspapers. My old baseball bat. I lurched toward it, my hands grabbing the worn, smooth ash wood. The weight of it was a small, pathetic comfort. I gripped it tight, my knuckles white. The scraping sound continued, a methodical, unhurried sound that grated on my very bones. Scree. C-H-R-R-R-R. It was moving downward, from the top of the door toward the lock. Then, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was complete. Total. I stood in the middle of the room, the bat held in a defensive stance, my body trembling. I listened, my ears strained, trying to catch any hint of sound, any clue. The drip in the kitchen had stopped. The building was silent. The city outside was silent. It was as if the world beyond these walls had ceased to exist. My gaze was locked on the doorknob. And it began to turn. Slowly. Terribly slowly. The old brass creaked, a faint high-pitched squeal. I could see the glint of the dim light from the window catching the curve of the metal as it rotated. Clockwise. Inch by inch. It was turning from the other side, but there was no one on the other side. The hallway was empty. I knew it. A choked sound escaped my throat. I stumbled backward, my legs weak, and half fell behind the big, overstuffed armchair, my back pressing against the wall. I crouched, peering over the worn fabric top. I raised the bat high over my shoulder, my arms shaking so violently I thought I would drop it. My sweat was cold on my skin. I waited for the click of the latch. I waited for the door to swing open. I waited to see what was turning the handle. Minutes passed. 1, 2, 10. I don't know. I stayed crouched, my muscles screaming in protest, my eyes burning from staring at the door. Nothing happened. The doorknob stopped turning. It remained in its half-turned position. There was no click, no creak of hinges. Just the same, deep, listening silence. The sound had been a lie. A game. Slowly, painfully, I forced myself to stand. My legs were stiff, cramping. I held the bat out in front of me, taking one cautious step, then another, moving toward the door. My heart was a fist, clenched tight in my chest. I reached the door and stared at it. The knob was just as I had seen it, half-turned, frozen. The wood was unscratched. There was no mark, no sign of the horrible sound that had come from it. It was just a door. A sense of confusion warred with my fear. Had I imagined it? All of it? The click? The scraping? The turning knob? Was the whiskey, the guilt, the isolation finally cracking my mind? I let out a long, shuddering breath and turned around. Leaning my back against the cold, solid wood of the door that had become my prison wall, I let my eyes sweep across the room, my cage, the armchair, the table, the wall opposite me. I stopped. On the pale paint of the wall, there was a line. It was thin, fine as a strand of black hair. It started at the molding near the ceiling, ran straight down the entire height of the wall, bisecting it perfectly, and disappeared behind the baseboard at the floor. A crack. A crack that wasn't there 5 minutes ago. I knew this wall. I had stared at it for a year. It was blank. It was smooth. It was unmarked. And now it was broken. Exhaustion had won. It had pulled me down into a thick, dreamless blackness right there in my chair, the useless baseball bat slipping from my fingers to thump softly on the floor. I woke with my neck screaming in protest, a knot of petrified muscle where it had been wedged against the worn fabric. Gray morning light, thin and washed out, filtered through the grimy window. It painted the room in shades of dust and despair. My first coherent thought was of the wall. My head swiveled, the motion sending a fresh spike of pain down my spine. It was still there. The crack. A fine, dark fissure running from ceiling to floor. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a trick of the whiskey. It was a physical flaw in my cage. A scar on the skin of my prison. My mind, desperate for an anchor, scrambled for reason. This building was old. Foundations settle. Plaster gives way. It happens. It had to be that. A coincidence. A perfectly timed, horribly unsettling coincidence. I pushed myself up. My body a collection of aches and stiffness. The bat lay by my feet. I stared at it for a second, before nudging it with my toe, sending it rolling under the chair. A weapon against a settling foundation. I felt like a fool. The bathroom. I needed water. I needed to splash my face, to wash away the sticky film of fear and stale booze. I shuffled across the floorboards, my steps heavy. The bathroom was a small, tiled box, the grout stained and the mirror flecked with forgotten splashes of toothpaste. I leaned over the sink, turned the cold tap. It groaned in protest, and cupped the icy water in my hands. As I brought the water to my face, a smell hit me, acrid, sharp. The unmistakable scent of burnt rubber. My hands paused, water dripping through my fingers back into the basin. I lifted my head and sniffed the air. It was faint but definite. It smelled like a skid mark, like tires ground down to the belts on hot asphalt. I straightened up and looked toward the small, sealed bathroom window. Someone burning tires, I mumbled, the words sounding rough in the small space. Some kids in the alley. A protest. It could be anything. I forced myself to accept the explanation, to shove the new piece of wrongness into the box with the settling crack. I splashed my face, the cold shock a welcome distraction. I drank deeply from the tap, the metallic taste coating my tongue. I didn't care. I dried my face on the one stiff towel hanging from the rail, and stepped back out into the main room. The smell of burnt rubber was gone. Completely, as if it had never been there. In its place was something else. A new scent, hanging in the dead air. It was sweet. Cloyingly sweet. The scent of flowers, of cheap perfume. My stomach dropped. I knew that smell. I knew it in a way that went deeper than memory. It was seared into the part of my brain that played the accident on a loop. The police report had mentioned it. A strong floral scent was noted on the deceased's person and belongings. The officer had told me, his voice flat, professional. It was a detail I couldn't forget, a sensory ghost that had stalked my waking nightmares for 1 full year. The smell of her. No. The word slipped out, a dry whisper. No, it can't be. This time there was no rationalization, no box to put it in. This wasn't some kids in an alley. This wasn't the building settling. This was a message. My heart began to pound, a frantic, trapped bird against my ribs. I stalked the room, my head whipping back and forth, sniffing the air like a panicked animal. I sniffed the armchair, the curtains, the wall where the crack was. The scent was everywhere and nowhere. It wasn't coming from a source. It was the air itself. The very air I was breathing was saturated with it. Nausea rolled in my gut. I stumbled back, my eyes wide, scanning every corner of the room that was no longer just a room. It was a stage. It was a theater. And I was the only one in the audience. Then, the television clicked on. It was an old boxy thing I hadn't plugged in for months. The screen erupted into a chaotic dance of black and white static, a loud, hissing roar that filled the apartment. Shh! Shh! It was a violent, angry sound. I stared, frozen, as the static frothed. Underneath the hiss, something else emerged. A voice. It wasn't clear, just a low, murmuring cadence buried in the noise. The rhythm of a news anchor reading a teleprompter. A calm, steady stream of words I couldn't make out, drowning in the electronic storm. The sound was a physical assault. My hands flew up to cover my ears, and then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The screen went black. The roar vanished. Silence crashed back in, heavier, more profound than before. My own ragged breathing was unnervingly loud. That was it. I was done playing games. I was getting out. Out of the room. Out of the building. I didn't care if I had to break the door down. I ran to the window, the only other way out. If I could just get it open. I could yell. I could scream for help. My neighbor across the alley would hear me. My fingers clawed at the window frame, searching for the latch, the simple metal cam lock that was always there. My fingers found nothing but smooth, painted wood. I slid my hand up and down the seam where the two panes of the sash window met. Nothing. It was gone. The latch, the hardware, all of it had vanished. It was now just a single, solid sheet of glass embedded in the wall. I pressed my palms against it. It didn't rattle. It didn't give. It felt as solid as the concrete foundation. My reflection stared back at me. A pale, haggard man with wide, terrified eyes and a mouth agape. He was trapped. Utterly. I was trapped. A noise, somewhere between a sob and a scream, tore from my throat. My eyes darted around the room, a wild, frantic search for leverage, for a weapon, for a tool of defiance. The TV, the source of that noise. That goddamn TV. Primal rage, born of pure terror, took over. I spun around, seized the nearest wooden dining chair by its back, and hefted it. The cheap wood felt light, flimsy, but it was something. It was an answer. With a raw, guttural yell that ripped my throat, I swung it. I put every ounce of my fear, my guilt, my desperation into the motion, aiming for the center of that dead, black screen. I pivoted, my body screaming with the effort, and let the chair fly. It sailed across the small room and struck the television with a sickening, wet, implosive crunch. The plastic housing cracked. The dark glass screen spiderwebbed into 1,000 fractures. It was a satisfying, real, physical sound of destruction. Crack! The second sound was not from the TV. It was louder, sharper, like a rifle shot echoing from the other side of the room. It came from the window. I whipped my head around. My heart stopped. A new crack, jagged and white like a lightning bolt, had appeared on the window I had just tried to open. It spread out from a single impact point near the center, a spider's web of shattered hope carved into the glass. I hadn't touched the window. The chair had hit the TV. The two events were separate, impossible, yet they had happened at the same instant. At that exact moment, the air changed. The temperature plummeted. It was not a gradual cooling. It was a sudden, shocking plunge, as if a freezer door had been thrown open. A second ago, the room was stuffy. Now, it was icy. I saw my own breath plume in front of my face, a white cloud in the gray light. The cold bit at my exposed skin, sharp and immediate. And then, I felt it. A touch, on the back of my neck. A single, distinct point of cold, like a finger made of ice being pressed gently against my skin. It wasn't a draft. A draft is wide, moving. This was specific, deliberate, a calculated, intimate contact. I stopped breathing. The chair legs were still tangled in the wreckage of the TV. My breath hung in the air. The crack in the window stared at me like a malevolent eye, and something, or someone, was standing right behind me. With a strangled cry, I spun around, swinging my fists wildly at the empty air. There was nothing. No one. The spot where the touch had been was now just empty space. The intense, pinpoint cold on my neck vanished as quickly as it had come. The room was still freezing, but that specific personal chill was gone. I backed away, stumbling over my own feet until my back hit the far wall, the one with the original crack. I slid down it, my legs giving out, and landed hard on the floor. My eyes scanned the scene of my own violence. The TV was broken, its guts exposed. The chair lay on its side, one leg splintered. The window was fractured. This was real. This was damage. It wasn't in my head. I sat there, gasping in the freezing air, trying to force my heart back down from my throat. My eyes roamed the floor, tracing the patterns of dust and neglect. And then I saw it. It was small, lying on the floorboards, just past the edge of the threadbare rug. A glint of reflected morning light had caught my eye. Something that didn't belong. Not a piece of plastic from the TV. Not wood from the chair. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, I crawled forward. My hand trembled as I reached for it. My fingers closed around the object. It was cool to the touch. I lifted it into the pale light. It was a shard of glass, about the size of my thumb. It was thick, much thicker than window glass, and it had a distinct, gentle curve to it. It was ribbed on one side, smooth on the other. My blood ran cold. I knew this glass. I had seen pieces just like it glittering on dark asphalt under the strobing red and blue lights a year ago. It was from a car's headlight. The shard of glass felt heavy in my hand. Heavier than it should. My fingers were numb from the cold, but I could feel the sharp edges, the slight curve of its shape. On one side, the smooth face of the lens. On the other, the small, rigid lines of the fluting. It came from a headlight. A car's headlight. The thought wasn't a guess. It was a cold, hard piece of information lodging itself in my brain. I pushed myself backward across the floorboards, my body scraping against the wood. My back hit the corner of the room, the plaster cold and solid against my spine. I stayed there, crouched, a man huddled in the last safe space in the world. The shard was still in my palm. It was the only thing that felt entirely real. The broken TV. The fractured window, the freezing air, and this piece of glass. They were facts. Physical evidence. My mind raced, grabbing for anything that made sense. Gas leak. A slow leak from the old pipes, causing hallucinations. It happens. People see things, feel things. Or mold. Black mold in the walls. I'd read about that. It gets in your lungs, in your brain. It changes what you perceive. It had to be that. It had to be the building. Old wiring. Settling foundations. Toxic spores. My own mind. Finally breaking under the weight of the last year. I repeated the words to myself. A silent chant in the back of my throat. It's the building. I'm sick. I'm not well. I looked at the coffee table in the center of the room. A thick layer of gray dust coated its surface, a testament to months of neglect. It seemed thicker now, somehow, more substantial. A fine, soft blanket of gray powder over everything. The air was still bitingly cold. I drew my knees to my chest, my arms wrapped around them, my hand still clutching the piece of glass like a holy relic. The cold was a constant, a physical presence. My breath was still a visible cloud in the dim morning light. I decided not to sleep. I would sit here, in this corner, and I would watch. I would watch the room and prove to myself that nothing was happening. I would wait for the sun to rise higher, for the cold to fade, for the world to feel logical again. My eyes burned from exhaustion. They felt sandy, heavy. I needed to blink, to wet them. A simple, mechanical action. I blinked. It took less than a second. My eyelids slid shut, then open. The coffee table. Something was different. The uniform layer of gray dust was disturbed. In the center of the table, cutting through the film of grime, were clean lines of dark wood. Lines that formed shapes. That formed a word. One word. No. My breath caught in my chest. A painful, sharp hitch. It wasn't a hallucination. A hallucination is a flicker, a shadow in the corner of your eye. This was a statement. This was a change in the physical world. The dust had been there. Now some of it was gone, cleared away with a deliberate, precise motion. As if by a finger. I didn't scream. The sound wouldn't come. I unfolded myself from the corner, my joints protesting. I stood up, my legs trembling. The glass shard slipped from my fingers and hit the floor with a tiny, lost tink. I backed away from the table, my eyes locked on the word. The neat curve of the K. The perfect circle of the O. The clean sweep of the W. Someone had written that. Someone had been standing right there, in the middle of my room, and had written that word in the dust. My gaze darted around the apartment. The locked door. The solid, sealed window. There was no way in. No way out. But the proof was right there. A surge of anger, hot and sharp, cut through the cold fear. It was a violation. Someone was playing with me. A game. Who's there? My voice was rough, a sound I barely recognized. Who the hell are you? I yelled it at the empty air. At the cracked window. At the dead television. What do you want from me? The reply was a sound, a single, metallic thunk. And the world went black. Not dim. Not dark. It was a complete and total absence of light. The gray morning light from the window vanished as if a steel plate had slammed down over it. The dim glow from my alarm clock was gone. It was a suffocating, sightless blackness that pressed in on my eyes. And in the black, I heard it. A sound. Shuff. It came from the direction of my small bookshelf. A soft, sliding noise. Then, a quiet thud as something landed on the worn rug. A book. Someone had pushed a book off the shelf. My blood turned to ice. My ears strained, amplifying every tiny detail of the silence. Screep. The sound was closer. From the coffee table. The high-pitched, grating noise of a ceramic mug being dragged across the wood. The mug I had left there 2 days ago. It was moving. He was moving it. He was in the room with me. In the dark. I couldn't see, I couldn't breathe. I was a blind man, in a cage with a predator. I had to move. I had to get somewhere safe. The bathroom. The door had a lock. A simple turnbolt. But it was a lock. A barrier. I put my hands out in front of me, like a sleepwalker, and took a shuffling step forward. My bare feet met the cold floorboards. Every creak of the wood under my weight was a gunshot in the silence. It was telling him where I was. I shuffled forward, one hand trailing along the wall, my fingers searching for the familiar frame of the bathroom door. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild drumbeat of pure panic. Come on, come on. My outstretched fingers brushed against something. It wasn't the rough paint of the wall or the hard wood of the door frame. It was soft and cold, a deep, subcutaneous cold. I snatched my hand back as if I'd touched a hot stove. A quiet gasp escaped my lips. I had touched it. It was real. Click. The light came back on. All of it. The main overhead light, the lamp by my chair. It was a sudden, violent explosion of light that made me squint, my pupils contracting in pain. I stared. The room was not the same. It was a scene of chaos. The bookshelf was empty, its contents scattered across the floor in a messy pile. The coffee table was on its side. My armchair was flipped over, its worn legs pointing at the ceiling. It was a whirlwind of destruction that had happened in complete silence, save for the two small sounds I had heard. My eyes shot to the bathroom, to the mirror above the sink. The fine layer of dust that had been on the coffee table was gone. It was now on the mirror, smeared across the glass in thick gray letters. Big letters. A full sentence. The sentence he had started on the table. I know what you did." The words stared back at me, a silent accusation. My own reflection was trapped behind them, a pale, ghost-like figure with wide eyes and a mouth hanging open. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind unable to process the sheer impossibility of it. The speed, the silence, the message. I didn't move for a full minute. My brain was a feedback loop of fear and confusion. Then, slowly, my gaze drifted downward, away from the mirror, down to the floor. The dust from the table was everywhere now, a fine gray powder coating the floorboards. And in the dust were my footprints. The marks of my bare feet were clear, showing my panicked shuffle from the corner toward the bathroom door. But they weren't the only ones. Next to my prints there was another set. They were smaller than mine, neater, and they were barefoot. The clear, distinct outline of a sole, a heel, and 5 small toes. The prints were everywhere. They started near the broken window. They walked calmly to the coffee table. Then they moved to the bookshelf. They circled the overturned armchair. They walked to the light switch by the front door. They had moved with a quiet, deliberate purpose while I stood blind in the suffocating dark. My eyes followed the trail. It wound through the wreckage of my room like a snake. I watched their path, a map of the terror I had just endured. I followed them past the TV, past the chair, into the center of the room. The trail of small, bare footprints stopped. They stopped in a patch of dust on the wooden floor. They stopped right behind the spot where I was standing now. Time ceased to have meaning. I did not move. My muscles screamed, locked in a rigid posture of terror. My neck ached from being fixed in one position. My eyes were locked on the floorboards behind me, on the dust, on the second set of prints, the perfect, small outlines of a child's feet or a small woman's. Clean, deliberate. They were there. They were as real as the splintering wood beneath my own feet. The cold had sunk deep into my marrow. It was not the cold of a room anymore. It was the cold of a morgue slab. Hours must have passed. The gray light shifted, turning from the flat, dead light of dawn to the slightly warmer, but no less grim, light of midday. I marked the slow crawl of time by the changing shape of the shadow cast by the overturned armchair. My body began to betray me. A tremor started in my left calf, a low, uncontrollable vibration. My throat was a desert, each swallow a painful scrape. Thirst. A simple, animal need was finally overriding the paralysis. I had to move. Slowly, as if testing the integrity of my own bones, I lifted my right foot. I brought it forward, placing it carefully in a patch of clear floor, avoiding the trail of footprints. The floorboard creaked. The sound was a gunshot. I froze, listening. Nothing. Only the low hum of the building around me. I took another step. Then another. My path to the corner, where the small refrigerator sat, was a shuffling, hesitant dance around the evidence of my intruder. I kept my back to the wall, my eyes scanning the wreckage of the room with every step. The overturned table, the pile of books, the mirror with its damning sentence. My hand touched the cool, smooth plastic of the refrigerator door. The handle was cold. I pulled. The rubber seal parted with a soft, sucking sound, and the small interior light flickered on. I looked inside. Empty. The wire racks were bare. A single, dark stain marred the bottom shelf. That was all. My mind fought to make sense of it. A fog of exhaustion and fear clouded everything, but one clear thought pushed through. Milk. I bought milk yesterday. And eggs. I remember the weight of the plastic bag in my hand. I remember putting it away. I stood there, staring into the empty white box, a wave of dizziness washing over me. Maybe I didn't. Maybe I just thought about it. Maybe I left the bag in the hallway. No, I would have seen it. I looked back at the front door, still locked, still solid. I remembered locking it. I was sure of it. I must have forgotten to buy the groceries. My memory was full of holes. I was tired. I was just tired. I pushed the refrigerator door shut. It closed with a dull click. I leaned my forehead against it. The coolness, a small comfort. I took a breath. And then another. I had to think. I turned away from the refrigerator. My foot caught on something. I stumbled forward, my arms pinwheeling for balance. I looked down to see what I had tripped over. It was a carton of milk. It stood perfectly upright in the middle of the floor. A half-gallon carton, its cardboard sides cold with condensation. It hadn't been there a second ago. I had just walked through that exact spot. The floor had been empty. I stared at it, my brain refusing to process the information. It was impossible. I hadn't heard a sound, not a footstep, not a whisper. My gaze lifted from the milk carton. Something was wrong. The room, the perspective was off. The far wall, the one with the cracked window, looked farther away. Just by a few feet. The pattern of the faded wallpaper seemed smaller. The details slightly less distinct. It was like looking through the wrong end of a pair of binoculars. I squeezed my eyes shut, rubbing them hard with the heels of my hands until spots of color danced behind my eyelids. Exhaustion. Lack of sleep. It was playing tricks on my eyes. I opened them again. The milk was still there. And the wall was still too far away. A cold, methodical idea formed in the chaos of my thoughts. A test. I had to be sure. I fixed my eyes on the doorknob of the front door. I focused on its shape the way the dim light glinted off the cheap brass. I would not look away. My heart was a frantic hammer against my ribs. I closed my eyes. 1, I whispered, the sound cracking in my dry throat. My eyelids were heavy, pressing down. 2, the darkness behind them was complete. 3, I snapped them open. The doorknob was a tiny distant speck. The wall it was set in had receded by at least 20 feet. The room had stretched. It was no longer a small, squalid apartment. It was a long, distorted hall. My furniture, the overturned chair, the fallen table, looked small and isolated in the vast new space. The floorboards seemed to converge toward a vanishing point somewhere near the distant window. The air left my lungs in a ragged gasp. This wasn't a trick of the light. This wasn't exhaustion. The physical dimensions of my prison were changing. The room itself was playing with me, warping reality around me. It was stretching my sanity to its breaking point. Panic began to bubble up, hot and acidic. The door, my only hope of escape. It was moving away from me. With every second that passed, it was sliding farther and farther out of reach. It was an oasis in a desert, a mirage that receded as I approached. An animal cry tore from my throat. I didn't recognize the sound. It was pure, mindless desperation. I launched myself forward. I started to run. My bare feet slapped against the wood. 1 step. 2 steps. The door remained impossibly distant. The floorboards flowed beneath me like a river, pulling me backward even as I surged forward. It felt like running through deep water. My lungs burned. My legs were heavy, sluggish. I pumped my arms. My gaze locked on the door, on that small, unreachable brass circle. "Stop!" I screamed, the words swallowed by the cavernous space. Tears of rage and terror streamed down my face, mixing with the sweat. "God damn you, stop!" I pushed harder, a sob catching in my chest. My right foot came down wrong. My ankle twisted. A sharp, searing pain shot up my leg. I went down. Hard. My body slid across the polished wood, my cheeks scraping against the floor, the friction burning my skin. I came to a stop in a heap of tangled limbs and raw pain. I lay there for a second, panting, the taste of blood and dust in my mouth. My vision swam. Then, slowly, I pushed myself up onto my elbows. I lifted my head. The door was right in front of me. Not 20 feet away, not 50. It was maybe 6 feet from where I lay. It was back in its normal position. The room was its normal size. The overturned chair was close enough to touch. The illusion, the impossible stretching, was gone. It had snapped back into place the moment I fell. A giddy, disbelieving laugh escaped my lips. It was here. It was real. I could get out. I didn't try to stand. My ankle throbbed with a vicious, pulsating rhythm. I began to crawl. I pulled my body across the floor with my hands, my useless leg dragging behind me. It was a pathetic, desperate scramble. The cold brass of the doorknob was my grail, my salvation. My fingers wrapped around it. It was solid. It was real. I sobbed with relief. I turned the knob. The latch clicked back. I pulled the door open. It swung inward, revealing the space beyond. But it wasn't the dimly lit, grimy hallway of my apartment building. It wasn't the peeling paint and the faded carpet I knew. It opened onto a corridor that was long and narrow and dark. It stretched forward into an oppressive blackness, far beyond what should have been possible within the confines of the building. It was the same impossible space I had just been running through inside my own head. The room hadn't just stretched its own walls, it had breached them. It had carved a new, terrifying reality right through the fabric of the old one. The loop wasn't just the room anymore. The loop was space itself. And I had just opened the door to more of it. I slammed the door. The sound was a cannon blast in the sudden silence, a violent rejection of the black corridor that had stared back at me. I fumbled for the deadbolt, my fingers slick and clumsy, and drove it home. The heavy thunk was a period on a sentence of madness. For a moment, I pressed my forehead against the cool wood of the door, my breath coming in ragged, painful bursts. The impossible hallway was gone, but the knowledge of it was branded behind my eyes. This room, my prison, had just become my only refuge. A sanctuary with shifting walls and a hostile will. My ankles screamed. A sharp electric pulse shot from my foot to my knee with every beat of my heart. I collapsed onto my side, cradling the injured limb, a raw gasp escaping my lips. I couldn't put weight on it. I was trapped. Truly trapped. I pushed myself backward with my hands, my useless leg dragging across the floorboards. I needed to get away from the door, away from the gateway it had become. I slid across the dusty wood until my back hit the opposite wall. Here, in the corner, with the wall solid behind me, I could see the whole room. My eyes darted around, cataloging the familiar wreckage. The toppled chair, the scattered books, the milk carton standing like a small, white tombstone in the center of the floor. It all looked solid. It looked normal-sized. My gaze found the window, my one connection to a world that was supposed to make sense. Outside, the sky was a flat, overcast gray. The brick wall of the building across the alley was wet, dark from a rain I hadn't noticed. I needed to see something real. Something that followed rules. And then I saw it. A single leaf, brittle and brown, detached itself from a struggling tree branch in the small courtyard below. It spiraled down, a lazy, unhurried descent, finally coming to rest on the damp concrete. It was a simple thing. A leaf falling, an event so ordinary it was almost beautiful. A wave of something that felt like relief washed over me, so potent it made me dizzy. It was just a leaf. The world was still turning. Maybe I was just losing my mind. Maybe the pressure had finally broken me. The thought was terrifying, but less so than the alternative. Another leaf followed the first. It traced a nearly identical path through the air. Then a third. I watched, my breathing evening out slightly. It was late summer, but an early autumn wasn't impossible. A few leaves fall. It happens. Then 10 fell at once. They peeled away from the branches in a synchronized release, a small, rust-colored squadron diving toward the ground. My breath hitched. Then it was 20, 50, 100. The air outside the window filled with a sudden, silent storm of dead leaves. They didn't drift. They swirled in a frantic, accelerating vortex, a cyclone of brown and gold and crumbling red. It was a blizzard of decay, impossibly dense, impossibly fast. The sound began, not a gentle rustle, but a dry, abrasive hissing against the glass, like a million tiny claws scratching to get in. What the hell is this? The whisper was a dry scrape in my throat. The light in the room dimmed as the storm of leaves thickened, pasting themselves against the pane, blocking the gray sky. I began to crawl, dragging my throbbing ankle behind me. Each movement was an agony, a reminder of my weakness, my immobility. I had to see. I had to understand what was happening. I reached the window and pulled myself up, bracing my hands on the sill. I pressed my face close to the glass, the cold of it a shock against my skin. Through the few small gaps in the leafy shroud, I tried to see the alley, the brick wall, the fire escape. But they weren't there. The leaves began to thin, not by falling away, but by dissolving. They turned translucent, fading like old photographs left in the sun. And through their vanishing forms, I saw a new world. It was a forest. Not a park, not a few trees, but a deep, primal forest. Massive, ancient trunks, thick as columns, rose into a canopy so dense it blotted out the sky. The light that filtered through was green and murky, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and rot. A thick fog coiled around the base of the trees. There was no alley, no building, no city. My window on the third floor of a walk-up in the middle of the city now looked out into the heart of a wilderness that shouldn't exist. I jerked back from the glass as if it were electrified, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I stared, wide-eyed. It had to be a projection. A trick, but the detail was too perfect. I could see the texture of the bark, the individual ferns growing in the dark soil, the slow, silent drip of condensation from a broad leaf. The scene began to shift. The green light intensified, then bleached into a white-hot glare. The mighty trees withered before my eyes, their bark cracking and peeling, their leaves turning to ash and blowing away on a non-existent wind. The moist ground dried, cracked, and lifted, transforming into waves of rippling sand. The oppressive humidity was replaced by a dry, searing heat I could feel even through the glass. In seconds, the forest was gone. My window now overlooked a vast, sun-scorched desert. An endless sea of dunes stretched to a horizon that shimmered with heat. The silence was absolute, a profound emptiness that was more terrifying than any sound. My room was adrift. It was a raft, and I was its sole passenger, floating through landscapes of nightmare. I stared, mesmerized by the horror. The sand began to recede, sinking down as if pulled by a giant plug. The horizon darkened. The sound came first, a low, deep rumble that grew into the roar of 1,000 breaking waves. Water, dark and churning, rushed in to fill the void. A churning, violet ocean slammed against the dunes, swallowing them whole. My window was now looking out at a raging sea in the middle of a storm. Waves crested into monstrous walls of gray water, crashing down with a force that seemed to shake the entire building. Spray, cold and salty, hammered against the glass. One colossal wave rose higher than the others, its peak lined with white foam like a row of teeth, and for a heart-stopping second, I thought it would shatter the window and drown me in this room. But it broke just before impact, sending a cascade of water sluicing down the pane. I couldn't scream. My throat was locked. I could only watch as the ocean too began to change. The water drained away, the roaring faded, and a new vista resolved itself. A city. A ruined city. Skeletons of skyscrapers clawed at a sickly yellow sky. Streets were choked with rubble and burned-out husks of cars. Black, empty windows stared back at me like the vacant eyes of a million skulls. There was no movement, no life. Just the profound stillness of a world that had ended. I was trapped in a box. The world outside was a film, a series of hells playing on a loop, and there was no way to turn it off. There was nowhere to run. Every direction was a different kind of damnation. Then the ruined city faded to black. Complete, total blackness. For a long moment there was nothing. Just the reflection of my own terrified face in the dark glass. And then it settled on the final scene. A 2-lane highway at night. It was empty. The black asphalt stretched into the distance, flanked by dark, indistinct trees on either side. A pair of faint yellow lines ran down the middle, disappearing into the gloom. The ordinariness of it was somehow the most unsettling part. It felt specific. It felt familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. I watched, holding my breath. Far in the distance, 2 points of light appeared. Tiny. Like stars. They grew. They weren't stars. They were headlights. They were coming closer. Fast. My mind started working in short, sharp bursts. Car. On the road. Coming this way. Fast. The 2 points of light resolved into 2 distinct, circular beams. They grew larger, brighter, burning away the darkness around them. I could begin to make out the shape behind them. Wide. Square. A grill. The dark, hulking outline of a truck, a low hum, reached my ears, vibrating through the window frame, through the floor, up my legs. The hum grew into a deep-throated engine roar. Then another sound joined it. A high-pitched squeal. The sound of tires screaming on asphalt. The truck was swerving, braking, but it was too close, too fast. The twin headlights burned into my eyes, flooding my small room with a brilliant, merciless white light. Every object was thrown into sharp relief, every shadow erased. It was the light of an impending collision. It was the light of the end. A scream tore itself from my lungs, raw and mindless. I threw my arms over my face, squeezing my eyes shut. I fell backward from the window, my body hitting the floor with a jarring thud. I curled into a ball, bracing for the inevitable. For the shatter of glass, the shriek of twisting metal, the final, crushing impact that would obliterate me and this room forever. I waited for the pain. But it didn't come. There was only silence. A deep, profound silence that was more shocking than the sound had been. The blinding light behind my eyelids was gone. The engine roar had vanished. The screeching of tires was just an echo in my head. I lay on the floor, trembling uncontrollably. My heart was a wild thing trying to batter its way out of my chest. My ankle throbbed in time with the frantic rhythm. Slowly, cautiously, I uncurled myself. I took my arms away from my head. I opened my eyes. The room was dim again, lit only by the weak, gray light from outside. I looked toward the window. My breath caught. It was just my street, the familiar brick wall of the building across the alley. The fire escape. The wet concrete of the courtyard. Far below, the scattered leaves lay motionless. Everything was as it should be. As it always was. It hadn't happened. My mind. It was my mind. It had finally shattered. I was having a complete breakdown. The thought brought a strange, giddy wave of relief. It was all a hallucination. A vivid, terrifying nightmare brought on by fear and isolation. I had to be sure. Ignoring the fire in my ankle, I crawled back to the window, pulling myself up to the sill one last time. My hands shook as I braced them. I looked out, forcing myself to take in the mundane details. A plastic bag snagged on a railing. A stray cat darting across the alley. It was real. It was all real. My eyes fell on the spot on the glass where the truck's headlights had been centered, and I stopped breathing. There was a mark. It wasn't a crack or a shatter, it was a dent. A smooth, concave indentation in the very center of the glass pane, about the size of my fist. The glass was pushed inward, warped, its surface distorted like a heat mirage. I reached out a trembling finger and touched it. It was cold and solid. It was real. Something had struck my window from the outside. Something that had been moving with impossible speed. Something that had come from a highway that did not exist. Something from that other place had reached through and left a physical scar on my prison. My body was a thing made of glass, and the impact that never came had shattered it anyway. I lay on the floorboards, each tremor a new fissure running through me. The silence was a weight. Heavier than the roar of the truck, heavier than the imagined crush of steel. It pressed down, forcing the air from my lungs in shallow, useless puffs. Pain was the only constant. A hot wire spiraling up from my ankle. A steady, pulsing signal from a body that knew it was broken. It was real. The dent in the window proved it. A smooth, inward curve in the glass. A physical scar left by a phantom. The world I saw through the window was normal. The wet brick, the rusted metal of the fire escape. But that dent was a portal. A wound. Proof that the other place, the place with the highways and the dead cities, could reach through and touch my world. Touch me. Slowly, using my good leg and my elbows, I began to drag myself away from the window. The friction of my jeans against the splintered wood was a loud, tearing sound. Each movement sent a jolt of fire through my ankle. I didn't care. I needed to put distance between me and that warped piece of glass. I slid backward until my spine hit the base of the bed frame. I sagged against it, my head falling back, staring up at the water-stained ceiling. The thoughts were not thoughts anymore. They were just fragments, sharp pieces of glass tumbling in my skull. This room. This is it. This is the place. It wasn't just a prison. It was a sentence. A judgment, crafted just for me. The walls were the bars, the door was the lock, and the window was a screen playing back all the ways the world could end, all the ways I deserved to end. The guilt I had carried for a year, a heavy, shapeless thing in my gut, finally had a name. It was the name of this room. It was my fault. All of it. The accident. The running. The hiding. And this was the consequence. A personal, tailor-made hell. I needed to tell someone. I needed to scream for help, even if there was no one to hear. I was a man on a desert island, and my only chance was a message in a bottle. My eyes scanned the debris of the room, the landscape of my failure. Books, a dirty plate, the carton of spoiled milk. My phone, it lay near the far wall, screen dark, where I'd left it hours or days ago. A black, useless rectangle. My last attempt to use it had been met with the same two words. No service. A final disconnection. Useless. As useless as screaming. As useless as hope. A surge of something hot and bitter rose in my chest. Rage. A pathetic, impotent rage. At the room. At the locked door. At the dead phone. With a guttural cry that scraped my throat raw, I found a new strength. I crab-walked across the floor, my injured leg a dead weight behind me. My hand closed around the phone's cool, smooth case. It felt like a stone. I pulled my arm back and threw it. I threw it as hard as I could, not at anything in particular, just away from me. It hit the wall with a sharp plastic crack and clattered to the floor. The sound was small, unsatisfying. It landed face down. I watched it, my breath hissing through my teeth. Another pointless gesture. Another failed act of defiance. Then, the floor vibrated. A low hum. Almost too quiet to hear, but I felt it through the floorboards, through the palms of my hands. My eyes were fixed on the phone. A square of brilliant white light suddenly bloomed from its screen, casting a stark, cold glow on the dusty floor around it. It was ringing. The sound pierced the heavy air, a shrill, digital melody that was the most alien thing I had ever heard in this room. It was loud, aggressive, real, a stabbing, repetitive tune that drilled directly into my brain. My heart, which had been hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, seemed to stop altogether. Then it started again, a wild, painful thumping that matched the phone's frantic pace. On the glowing screen, I could see the words, sharp and clear. Unknown number. Hope was a poison. It flooded my system, a dizzying, nauseating rush that was indistinguishable from terror. Who? How? The questions didn't matter. A line had been cast into my prison. A voice from the outside. A hand reaching into the dark. I moved without thinking, crawling, scrambling, dragging my useless limb across the floor. The pain in my ankle was a distant thing, a background noise to the screaming hope in my head. My fingers closed around the phone. The plastic was warm. It vibrated in my palm, a frantic, living thing. I fumbled it, almost dropping it. My thumb smeared across the screen, swiping at the green icon. The ringing stopped. The sudden quiet was more jarring than the noise had been. I pressed the phone to my ear, my hand shaking so badly that the hard plastic clicked against my teeth. Hello? The word was a mouse's squeak, a dry rustle of sound. Hello? Is anyone there? Silence. Not the room's silence. This was different. This was the empty, waiting silence of an open phone line. I could hear a faint hiss, a sound like wind blowing over a microphone from a great distance away. Please, I whispered, my voice breaking. Please, can you hear me? I need help. And then I heard it. A breath. A long, slow, rattling intake of air. It was a wet sound, labored and weak, like lungs struggling to pull air through fluid. It was a sound of immense effort, of immense pain. It was the sound of someone an inch from death. My blood ran cold. The hope in my veins turned to ice. This wasn't a rescue. A voice came through the static, so faint I wasn't sure I'd heard it at all. It was thin, stretched, and distorted, like an old recording played on a warped tape. A woman's voice. It whispered one word, a long, drawn-out exhalation of sound that was more accusation than question. Why? The single word hung in the air between the phone and my ear. It contained a universe of suffering. It was not a question of logistics. It was a question of existence, of betrayal, of pain. And I knew that voice, not because I had ever heard it, but because I had imagined it 1,000 times in my darkest hours. In the sweat-soaked moments of waking at 3 a.m. It was her, the woman from the accident. The phone wasn't a lifeline. It was an umbilical cord connecting me directly to my sin. It was a new instrument, a new method of torment. My hand started to pull the phone away from my ear, to smash it, to destroy the connection. But I couldn't. My fingers were locked in place. I had to listen. Tears sprang to my eyes, hot and sharp. They ran down my face, dripping from my jaw onto my shirt. Sobs racked my body, great, heaving convulsions of guilt and terror. I'm sorry, I screamed into the phone, the words tearing out of me. God, I am so sorry. I didn't mean to. I panicked. I'm sorry. I babbled, confessing to the static, to the hissing void, to the ghost on the line. I begged. I pleaded for a forgiveness I knew I could never receive. I poured out every wretched, cowardly secret I had held inside for a year. The weak, rattling breath on the other end stopped. The static hissed for a long moment. Then the voice came again. It was completely different. All the distortion was gone. The weakness, the pain, the ethereal quality, it all vanished. What replaced it was a voice that was perfectly clear, perfectly calm, and cold. Colder than the concrete floor, colder than the dent in the window, as cold as a morgue slab. "What are you sorry for?" I stopped. A sob caught in my throat. The change was so absolute, it was like a physical shock. The new voice was clipped, precise, and held no emotion at all. For the accident," I stammered, confused. "For what I did." There was another pause. Not a strained silence, but a deliberate, measured one. A silence that judged. Then the voice replied, each word a perfectly formed shard of ice. "You didn't cause an accident." The words didn't register at first. They were gibberish. They broke the rules of my world, of my guilt, of this entire punishment. Before I could form a question, before my brain could even process the statement, the phone emitted a deafening shriek. It was a high-frequency squeal, a sound of pure electronic agony that stabbed deep into my ear. I cried out and yanked the phone away, dropping it. It hit the floor with a clatter. The screen went black. The line was dead. I sat there, in the sudden, echoing quiet. The pain in my ear was a dull throb, but it was nothing compared to the chaos in my head. "You didn't cause an accident." The sentence played on a loop, a cold, clear voice cutting through the fog of my self-hatred. It wasn't a reprieve. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a negation. It was a bomb that had just detonated at the very foundation of my reality. If I wasn't being punished for my crime, then what was this? Why was I here? My gaze lifted from the dead phone, sweeping across the room. I was looking for something, anything, that made sense. A clue. An answer. My eyes fell on the wall opposite me, the one the phone had struck. There was a crack, a thin hairline fracture I hadn't noticed before, zigzagging down from the ceiling. But that wasn't right. I had thrown the phone at the base of the wall. The crack was near the top. And it was growing. Even as I watched, it forked, a new tiny line branching off to the side with a faint grating sound, like stone grinding on stone. I stared, mesmerized. The foundation of this place was breaking apart. Then, I saw the color. From the deepest part of the main crack, something was beginning to emerge. A single, dark droplet. It was thick, almost black in the dim light. It clung to the plaster for a second, catching the gray light from the window, reflecting it with a wet sheen. Then it gathered weight, elongated and dripped. It traced a slow, viscous path down the wall, leaving a dark red smear in its wake. It looked like blood. Another drop welled up beside the first one. Then another. A slow, steady bleeding from the bones of the building. The room wasn't just a prison. It was a living thing, and the voice on the phone had just sliced it open. The statement was an anchor, and it had been cut. I drifted in the noise inside my head. You didn't cause an accident. It wasn't a pardon. It felt like a resentencing for a crime I didn't even know I had committed. The bleeding wall was the only thing that felt certain. My eyes were fixed on the slow, dark red trails. They weren't just dripping. They were being pushed out, forced from a wound. My breath was a ragged thing in my chest. The pain in my ankle was a white-hot nail pinning me to the floor, but a new current ran through me. It wasn't hope. It was a cold, sharp-edged curiosity. If this wasn't judgment for what I did on the highway, then what was it? Who was judging? Akahi, Akahi. I started to move. It wasn't a choice. It was an impulse. Using my good leg and my palms, I pushed myself across the floor. The splinters of wood scraped my skin. The journey of 10 feet was a marathon across a landscape of my own filth and failure. I left a smeared trail in the dust. The pain in my ankle screamed with every shove, a grinding of bone I felt in my teeth. I ignored it. I had to touch the wall. I had to know it was real. The air grew colder as I got closer. An inorganic chill, like a walk-in freezer. The smell hit me then. Not just the sour scent of spoiled milk or my own sweat. Underneath it was something else. A coppery, metallic tang. The smell of a fresh wound. The smell of the streaks on the wall. My fingers, trembling, stretched out. They touched the wall, inches from one of the weeping lines. It wasn't plaster. The surface was cold. Not the passive cool of drywall, but a deep, biting cold that leached the warmth from my fingertips. It felt solid, unyielding. I tapped it with my fingernail. Tink. A high, metallic sound. I did it again. Tink, tink. It was metal, a sheet of metal beneath a thin, brittle layer of paint and plaster. The sentence from the phone echoed, "You didn't cause an accident." A question began to form, a tiny, terrible seed of an idea. If I wasn't the cause, what was I? My prisoner's despair began to curdle, changing into something else. The fear of a victim. I wasn't a penitent in a cell. I was an accident specimen in a jar, and something was looking in. With a shard of focus I didn't know I possessed, I found a spot near the crack where the plaster had bubbled. I dug my thumbnail into it. The white coating flaked away easily, like sunburnt skin, falling to the floor in a small, dusty pile. I scraped again, harder, my nail grating against the surface beneath. More plaster fell away, revealing a patch of the metal, the size of my palm. It was painted, a deep, midnight blue, the kind of color that looks black in the shadows. The surface was marred. Long, ugly scratches ran through the paint, silver lines showing the metal beneath. I saw a deeper gouge, a place where the metal itself was dented inward, the blue paint flaking around its edges. My heart stopped. It just stopped. That blue. I knew that blue. I had picked it out myself at the dealership, the blue of my Honda Civic. And the scratch. I knew that scratch. The one I got from misjudging the turn into the parking garage on 4th Street, a year and a half ago. A cold sweat broke out over my entire body. A drenching, instant wave. This wasn't a wall. This was a car door. The geometry of my world shattered. My head snapped up, my eyes darting around the room, not as a captive, but as someone trying to understand the shape of their coffin. The room wasn't a room. It was an assemblage. A monstrous sculpture built from a memory. My gaze fell on the greasy, overstuffed armchair I had been sleeping in. The fabric was ripped along the side, exposing yellowed foam and a jagged metal bar from the frame. It wasn't an armchair, it was the driver's seat, torn from its moorings. The low coffee table, its surface a mosaic of cracked plastic and broken glass. It was the dashboard, shattered and collapsed. The single window. The dent, the spider web of cracks spreading from it. It was the windshield, buckled inward from an impact. I wasn't in an apartment. I was inside the wreckage. I was trapped inside the mangled, compressed, and twisted metal of my own car. A memory made solid. A cage built for my final moments. My breath came out in a single choked word. A sound that held the whole, awful truth. Purgatory. The word hung in the air, and the air responded. It started with a sound. Not a crash from outside, but a deep, resonant groan from the thing itself. The sound of stressed metal giving way. The floor pan of the car, bucked beneath me. I was thrown sideways, my head slamming against the cold blue metal of the wall door. A flash of white light exploded behind my eyes. The pain in my ankle erupted, no longer a nail but a white-hot explosion, as if the injury had just happened all over again. The groaning intensified, becoming a deafening shriek of tearing steel. The entire structure was moving, constricting. I looked up. The water-stained ceiling was no longer 10 feet above me. It was 8, and it was getting closer. The plaster was cracking and raining down in a fine powder that filled my lungs. The roof of the car was caving in. The walls moved next. The blue wall door and the one opposite it began to press inwards. The space was shrinking. I was being crushed. Panic, pure and animal, seized me. I tried to scramble back, to find a space, but there was nowhere to go. My shoulders were pinned between the two advancing walls. The pressure built, forcing the air from my lungs. My ribs felt like they were about to crack. I was being squeezed, compacted like trash. Through the shrieking metal, new sounds bled through. They were faint at first, distorted, as if coming from underwater. A long, rising and falling wail. A siren. Multiple sirens. The sound grew louder, more distinct. I heard shouting, panicked voices I couldn't understand. The sounds of the outside world, the real world, were leaking into my tomb. Then a voice cut through the chaos. It wasn't on a phone, it wasn't in my head. It was right beside my ear, a desperate, urgent whisper, so close I could feel the warmth of its breath. Jack, hang on! Oh God! Son, hang on! My blood froze. The pressure on my chest, the screaming metal, the lack of air, it all receded into the background. It was my father's voice. I couldn't turn my head. I was locked in place, a piece of meat in a vice. Dad? The thought was a broken shard. How? He was 1,000 miles away. He couldn't be here. He couldn't. "The jaws are almost through," another voice shouted farther away. "He's pinned!" The pressure on my chest became immense. Black spots danced in my vision. My lungs burned. This was it. This was the end. For real this time. The memory was finishing its work, and then it stopped. The shriek of metal cut off. The pressure vanished. The sounds of the outside world faded into nothing. With a final, faint groan, the walls receded. The ceiling lifted. The space returned to its previous dimensions, a 10 by 10 box of plaster and wood. The silence that rushed in was deafening. I lay on my side, gasping, my body trembling uncontrollably. Sweat and dust and plaster caked my face. My mind was a blank slate, wiped clean by the terror. I didn't understand. I didn't understand any of it. My father's voice. Slowly, shakily, I pushed myself up into a sitting position, my back against the base of the bed frame. My body ached with a profound, bone-deep soreness, as if I'd been in a fight. I needed to ground myself. I needed something real. I looked down at my hands, resting on my knees. They were not my hands. The hands I knew were a man's hands. Calloused from work, a small white scar on the left index finger from a kitchen knife. These hands were different. They were smaller, the fingers thinner, the skin smooth and unblemished. There were no calluses, no scar. They were the hands of a boy, a teenager. Then I saw what was in them. Lying in the palm of my right hand, as if it had been there all along, was a set of keys. Not my keys. My keys were heavy, a janitor's jumble of office keys and apartment keys. This was a simple set. A single, silver car key with a black plastic head. 2 small brass house keys. They were held together on a simple silver ring. And dangling from the ring was a small, worn, brown teddy bear keychain. One of its black button eyes was missing. I stared at the keys. I stared at the childish keychain. My heart hammered a slow, heavy, confused rhythm against my ribs. These weren't my hands. These weren't my keys. The memory that this room was built from. The sin I was paying for. It wasn't mine. The keys lay heavy in my palm. Not my palm. The skin was too smooth, the fingers too slender. I stared at the silver ring, the 2 small brass house keys, the single Honda key. Its black plastic head was smooth, worn from a use I couldn't place. And the bear. The little brown keychain, its fur matted, one black button eye staring up at me, the other, a nest of broken brown threads. A tremor started in the foreign hand that held them, a faint vibration that traveled up my arm and into my chest. A memory, thin as smoke, tried to form. The smell of cheap cherry air freshener. The feeling of worn cloth seats. Music from the radio. A song I didn't know, and a laugh next to me. A girl's laugh. The keys weren't mine. The hands weren't mine. That laugh. No, the word was a dry scrape in my throat. That's not right. I shook my head, a useless gesture, trying to dislodge the thought like a piece of grit in my eye. The truth was a shard of glass working its way into my brain. I had to see. I had to know. I pushed myself up. My body was a ruin of aches left over from the phantom pressure of the walls, but the searing pain in my ankle was gone. It felt weak, unsteady, but whole. I used the bed frame to haul myself to my feet. The room tilted. For a moment, the world was a brown and gray smear. I planted my feet, waiting for it to settle. The floor felt solid beneath me. It was just wood. The walls were just plaster. I took a tentative step, then another. The short journey from the bed to the bathroom door, a distance I had crawled in agony before, was now just 4 clumsy strides. My hand closed around the cold brass doorknob. It turned easily. The door swung inward without a sound. The bathroom was the same filthy sanctuary. The cracked toilet, the grimy sink, the mold-stained shower curtain, and the mirror. A layer of grime and soap scum couldn't hide its reflective surface. I stood before it, my new hands gripping the edge of the porcelain sink. The ceramic was cold, real. I braced myself and looked up. The face that looked back was not mine. It was a boy. 17, maybe 18 at most. His dark hair was damp and stuck to his forehead. His face was pale, his eyes wide and dark with a confusion that mirrored my own. And on his forehead, just above his right eyebrow, a dark purple and blue bruise was blooming, the kind of injury that comes from a sharp, sudden impact. A cold wave washed through me, starting in my stomach and spreading to every limb. I let go of the sink and took a step back, my bare heel hitting the leg of the toilet. The boy in the mirror stumbled back at the exact same moment. My hand, the teenager's hand, rose uncertainly toward my face. In the mirror, his hand did the same. I touched my forehead. The skin was smooth, untouched. But in the reflection, the boy's fingers ghosted over the ugly, swollen bruise. I knew that face. I had shaved that face, watched it break out with acne, seen it smile nervously on the way to prom. It was me. A version of me from a lifetime ago. The realization didn't come with a shout. It was a silent implosion. The entire structure of my guilt, the heavy architecture of my sin that I had lived in for so long, collapsed into dust. The hit and run. The screech of tires. The shattering of glass. The weight of what I had done, it wasn't my weight to carry. I wasn't the one driving. I was in the passenger seat. The memories now came back not as smoke but as a flood. Sarah. Her name was a physical blow. Her hands on the steering wheel, her knuckles white. The stupid argument we were having. Something about a party, about her friends. Her turning to look at me, her mouth open to say something. Me, looking out the passenger window at the rain-slicked road. The sudden, blinding glare of headlights where there shouldn't have been any. The memory of the sin I was paying for wasn't mine. It was a story I had told myself. A lie my shattered mind had constructed in the dark because the truth was so much worse. It's easier to be the villain in your own story. It gives you a sense of control, a reason for the pain. The alternative, the truth, was that I was just luggage. A helpless passenger in someone else's tragedy. A survivor. The feeling in the room changed. The malevolent presence that had been pressing in on me, the conscious intelligence that had tortured and toyed with me, was gone. The air lost its teeth. The deep, resonant cold receded. There was no more groaning metal, no more weeping walls. The room wasn't trying to punish me anymore. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the tense, waiting silence of a predator. It was the heavy, awkward silence of a sick room. The silence of pity. The room, this cage built from the wreckage, knew the truth before I did. It had been playing along with my delusion, reenacting my judgment. Now that the lie was broken, it had no purpose. It just sat there, a collection of broken things. A torn seat, a shattered dashboard, a buckled windshield, a dented door, a tomb that had lost its ghost. My gaze drifted from my own young, bruised face in the mirror and fell onto the glass itself. I stared, my breath held in my chest. I watched as a thin, black line appeared near the top edge, without sound. It snaked its way down the center of the mirror, a crack forming in the silver. It forked, then forked again. A web of fractures spreading silently across the glass, ruining the image of the boy I used to be. It didn't just crack, it exploded. A single, sharp report like a gunshot filled the small bathroom. The mirror blew outward, not falling, but bursting into 1,000 tiny cubes of glass that rained down into the sink and onto the floor. They skittered across the tile with the sound of sand being thrown. I flinched back, shielding my face with my arms, but none of it touched me. When I lowered my arms, the frame of the mirror was empty, a dark, hollow rectangle on the wall. The space within it was a perfect, featureless black. A shape stepped out of the blackness. It didn't crawl or lurch. It simply stepped through the empty frame as if passing through a doorway, its foot landing silently on the grimy tile floor. My heart hammered against my ribs. A wild, trapped animal. But this wasn't a monster. It was a girl. She was wearing a simple blue dress, the one I remembered. Her blonde hair was tucked behind one ear. Her face was pale, her expression not accusing, not angry. It was just sad. A deep, bottomless sadness that seemed to absorb all the light in the room. It was Sarah. She looked at me, her eyes meeting mine across the small space. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. She was the ghost. The memory. The reason for all of this. I waited for the screaming, the condemnation, the rage I deserved for living when she didn't. It never came. Her lips parted, and her voice was exactly as I remembered it. Not a whisper, not an echo, just her voice. Quiet. Real. "It wasn't your fault, Jack," she said. The words were a soft absolution, a key turning in a lock I didn't know I was trapped behind. "Let go." She raised her hand, not to point at me, but past me, toward the open doorway of the bathroom, toward the main room. "Go!" I couldn't tear my eyes away from her, from the impossible reality of her standing in my bathroom. But her gaze was insistent, pushing me to turn. I did. Slowly. My muscles stiff. I looked out into the room. The main door, the one that had been my impassable barrier, the symbol of my confinement, was no longer sealed. It was ajar, a thin sliver of light, warm and golden, cut through the gloom, painting a long, bright rectangle on the dusty floor. I could feel a draft, a current of clean, fresh air that smelled of damp earth and night. It was the smell of outside, the smell of freedom. It was an invitation. My chest ached with a sudden, sharp pang of hope so intense it was painful. I could leave. I could just walk out. I turned back to the bathroom, my mouth open to say her name, to say thank you, to say I'm sorry, to say something, anything. She was gone. The bathroom was empty. The dark, hollow frame of the mirror hung on the wall. The floor was littered with shattered glass. There was no sign she had ever been there. My mind screamed that I had imagined it. Another trick of this place. Another symptom of my broken sanity. But then I saw it. On the floor, in the middle of the scattered, sparkling shards of the mirror, sat a single shoe. A white canvas sneaker. One of the laces was untied. There was a small, dark scuff mark on the rubber toe. My blood ran cold. I knew that shoe. I had seen it before. Not on her foot, but lying by itself on a dark, wet stretch of asphalt, caught in the harsh glare of a police officer's flashlight. A single, lonely piece of evidence in the debris field of our lives. Her shoe. It was real. She was real. And the door was open. Her shoe. It was real. The truth of it was a rock in my gut, heavier than the guilt I had carried. Solid. I took a step back from the bathroom, my bare heel crushing a cube of mirror glass. The sound was small, like ice cracking. My eyes were fixed on the white canvas sneaker, the untied lace, the scuff on the toe. It was proof. She had been here. Her ghost, her memory, whatever she was, had come back to give me a key. Not a key to a door, but an absolution. It wasn't your fault. My gaze lifted from the shoe and found the main door. The sliver of warm light was a promise. The cool draft was an invitation. For a year, or what felt like a year, that door was a solid slab of steel, a wall between me and the world. Now, it was just a door. And it was ajar. I moved. My feet were clumsy on the floorboards, avoiding the larger piles of glass by instinct. My body still felt like a stranger's, the 18-year-old body from the mirror, but it moved with a purpose that was mine alone. I stopped before the door and looked back at the room one last time. There was no more groaning metal. The walls were just plaster, stained and peeling. The bed was a mattress on a simple frame, the sheets twisted into a nest. A dirty coffee cup sat on the nightstand. The dent in the wall was just a dent. The entire, suffocating weight of the place had vanished. The malevolence was gone, replaced by a cheap, tawdry emptiness. The room wasn't a monster anymore. It was just a shitty one-room apartment. A tomb whose torment had been built from a lie. My lie. The hope was a painful, sharp thing in my chest. A muscle I hadn't used in so long it screamed in protest. This could be another trick. Another level of the game. But Sarah's shoe was on the floor. That felt like the only truth left. I reached out. My hand, the slender hand of a boy, flattened against the door's cheap wood veneer. It felt solid. Real. The grain was rough under my fingertips. I pushed. It swung inward smoothly on its hinges. The rectangle of light on the floorboards widened. I peered through the growing gap. There was no hallway. No stained carpet. No buzzing fluorescent light of an apartment building corridor. I saw a single star, a hard, white point of light in a field of perfect black. Then another, and another, a vast, deep canopy of them. And below, nothing, just darkness. A current of air washed over my face. It was cool and clean. It smelled of damp soil, of wet grass, of night. The smell of outside. The smell of freedom. The pressure inside my skull. The one I had lived with for so long I had forgotten what it was like to be without it. Eased. It wasn't a feeling of joy. It was simpler than that. It was just an absence. The absence of pain. the absence of the walls pushing in. This was it. Release. I pushed the door all the way open and took a step through the frame. My bare foot landed not on concrete or tile, but on cool, damp grass. The sharp blades pricked the sole of my foot. The shock of it traveled up my leg. I took another step, leaving the room behind me. The door did not slam shut. There was no sound at all. I was standing in a field. The grass was knee-high, wet with dew that soaked the cuffs of my jeans. A light wind moved through it, making the stalks whisper against each other. It was the only sound. Above me, the sky was a dome of stars, brighter and clearer than any I had ever seen. The air was cold on my bare arms. In the distance, a low smear of orange and yellow light marked the edge of a small town. I'm out. The words were a ragged whisper. I looked back. The door and the frame it was set in stood freestanding in the middle of the field, a bizarre, impossible rectangle. Through the open doorway, I could see the messy room. The unmade bed. The grimy little bathroom beyond. A cage with its door wide open. It was over. The understanding hit me with the force of a physical blow. A knot inside my chest that had been tight for a year finally came undone. My knees buckled. I fell forward onto my hands and knees in the wet grass. My shoulders began to shake. A sound tore itself from my throat. A raw, ugly noise that was half a sob and half a gasp for air. Tears streamed down my face, hot against my cold skin. They weren't tears of sadness or of guilt. They were tears of pure, agonizing relief. The weight was gone. I was free. I was alive, and I was free. I stayed there for a long time, my forehead pressed to the damp earth, letting it all pour out of me. The sobs eventually quieted, leaving me hollowed out and shivering in the night air. I pushed myself up, wiping my face with the back of my hand. My legs were unsteady, but they held me. I looked toward the distant lights of the town. It was a destination, a beginning. I started walking. Each step was a small victory. The wet grass swished against my legs. The cold air filled my lungs. I didn't look back at the impossible door. It was part of a nightmare I was leaving behind. I had taken maybe 50 steps when I heard it. It was a faint sound at first, carried on the wind. A cough. A sputter. The strained, grinding noise of a starter motor failing to catch. I stopped, my head tilted. The sound didn't belong here. It was a mechanical intrusion in the natural quiet of the field. It came again, closer this time. Grind, 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 chug, and then the engine caught. It settled into a low, rough idle. A familiar sound. A 4-cylinder engine. A cold dread began to seep into the edges of my relief. I turned around, slowly. The freestanding door was gone. The apartment was gone. In its place, not 20 yards away, sat a car. A dark blue Honda Accord. The front end was staved in, a mangled ruin of plastic and steel. The hood was bent into a sharp V. One headlight was gone. A dark, empty socket. The windshield wasn't glass anymore. It was 1,000 interlocking cracks. A white spiderweb that obscured the inside. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was the car. Our car. As I stared, the single remaining headlight flickered on. A beam of white light shot out, cutting through the darkness and pinning me where I stood. It illuminated the blades of grass around my feet, turning them a sickly, washed-out green. The engine revved, a sharp, angry sound that shattered the night. The final piece of the puzzle, the one my mind had refused to look at, slammed into place. The truth wasn't that I was the driver. The truth wasn't that I was the passenger who survived. The hit and run. Sarah turning to look at me. The stupid argument. Her knuckles on the wheel. The sudden glare of headlights from the crossroad we were approaching. Headlights where there shouldn't be any. The screech of tires. Not ours, but the other vehicles. Too late. The memory was no longer smoke. It was a series of brutal, physical facts. The sound. Not a crash. A detonation. The world tearing apart in a shriek of metal. The feeling. Being thrown forward, the seatbelt locking hard across my chest, stealing my breath. The snap of the seat breaking. My head hitting the dashboard. Not a dull thud. A wet, cracking sound. The glass. The passenger side window exploding inward, a spray of tiny sharp cubes. The room wasn't a prison built by my guilt. It was the last desperate fiction of a dying brain. It was a translation. The groaning metal wasn't the building settling. It was the chassis of the Honda, twisted and dying around me. The dripping sound wasn't a leaky faucet. It was radiator fluid or blood pattering onto the floor mat. The pressure of the walls wasn't a supernatural force. It was the buckled door pressing against my side. The bed I kept waking up in was the wrecked passenger seat I was slumped in. The year of torment wasn't a year. It was the last 3 seconds of my life, stretched into an eternity by a mind refusing to let go. The guilt wasn't mine. It was a story I told myself to explain the pain. A reason for the cage. Because the truth was so much simpler, and so much more horrifying. There was no reason, it was just chance. A drunk driver running a stop sign. Wrong place, wrong time. I wasn't the villain. I wasn't the survivor. I was the victim. My gaze dropped from the wrecked car. The field was gone. The grass was gone. I was standing on dark, wet asphalt. A 2-lane country road. I looked down at myself. I wasn't wearing jeans and a t-shirt. I was in the clothes I wore that night. Khaki pants, a dark polo shirt. My hands weren't the hands of a boy. They were my hands, the hands of a 28-year-old man. The teenager in the mirror, a memory of a younger, more innocent self. Another ghost in the machine. The engine roar grew louder. I looked up. The wrecked car wasn't there anymore. Coming toward me, its high beams blazing, was a big, dark pickup truck. It was moving fast. Faster than it should be. It swerved into my lane. I understood then. I understood everything. The room. The games. Sarah's ghost. The open door. It was all a prelude. A final, frantic dream before the loop reset. The loop wasn't the room. The loop was the impact. I didn't try to run. There was nowhere to run to. I just stood there on the asphalt, watching the 2 white lights grow. Consuming the darkness, consuming everything. I saw the grill. The Ford logo. The face of the man behind the wheel. A mask of panic. It wasn't a punishment. It was just what happened. And it was happening again. The world did not end in a shriek of metal. It dissolved. The blinding white of the headlights bled away, and the asphalt under my feet softened, giving way. I was on my feet, walking. The cold I felt was no longer the damp of a field, but the dry, biting chill of a late autumn night in the city. The air smelled of exhaust and damp concrete, the faint, sour tang of garbage from an alleyway I just passed. My jacket was thin. I hunched my shoulders, digging my hands into the pockets. A book of matches, a crumpled receipt, no keys. I checked my other pockets. Nothing. I must have left them on the bar. Damn it. A headache pulsed behind my eyes, a dull, familiar throb in time with my steps on the cracked pavement. One too many. Always one too many. The memory of the last hour was a smear of brown liquor and loud voices. Before that, nothing. A bad dream, maybe. Something about a field. A room. It slipped away as I tried to hold it, like smoke. I was Jack. Middle-aged. A little soft around the middle. My knees ached from the walk. I lived 3 more blocks away. A shabby apartment with a view of a brick wall. Home. The street was deserted. Streetlights cast long, lonely cones of orange onto the road. Most were out. The city was always letting things break. I kept my eyes on the sidewalk in front of me, watching for fissures that could turn an ankle. Then I heard it. A low thumping. A musical bass line, muffled by distance but insistent. It was coming from behind me. A car. The thumping grew louder, resolving itself into the angry rhythm of some fast, synthesized beat. The sound was accompanied by the low rumble of a modified exhaust. A kid's car. I didn't turn. Just a kid showing off on an empty street. I felt a flicker of irritation, the kind of dumb, pointless noise that grated on you when all you wanted was to get home and fall into bed. I shuffled to the right, my shoes scraping on the edge of the curb, giving him the whole road. Let him pass. Let him take his noise somewhere else. The rumble grew into a roar. The bass was a physical pressure against my back now. And the light, the weak orange from the street lamps, was washed out by a harsh, white glare projected onto the pavement in front of me. It stretched my shadow out, making it a tall, skeletal figure that danced ahead of me. He was close, way too close. My irritation began to curdle. This wasn't a kid passing by. This was something else. The engine noise wasn't fading as it should. It was holding steady, a deep-throated growl that filled the silence of the street. He wasn't going around. He was right behind me. I stopped walking. My own shadow stopped with me, a black cutout against the brilliant white light. I could feel the heat from the headlights on the back of my neck. I could hear the pop and crackle of the engine. The music was a frantic, relentless pounding. Why wasn't he stopping? Why wasn't he swerving? Habais qualiater har. The logic of the situation crumbled. There were no other cars. The street was wide. This made no sense. A bead of sweat traced a cold path down my spine. The throb in my head sharpened. This was not a drunk kid. This was wrong. My heart hammered against my ribs, a fast, panicked counter-rhythm to the music. I had to move. I had to look. I turned. It took a fraction of a second. An eternity. My body felt slow, encased in something thick and heavy. My neck creaked. My eyes struggled to adjust to the sudden, overwhelming light. Two beams. Pure. White. Intense. They burned away everything else. Behind them I could make out a shape. Low. Wide. The dark grille of a muscle car. It was maybe 10 feet away. It wasn't slowing down. It was accelerating. The roar of the V8 engine was a physical blow, a wall of sound that hit me in the chest. There was no time to scream. No time to jump. No time to even register the face behind the wheel. There was only time for the light, the sound. The final, brutal fact of it. The bumper hit my legs first. I didn't feel pain. I felt a tremendous, indifferent force. I heard a sound, a wet, snapping crack that came from inside my own body. Both my shins broke at once. The world tilted crazily as I was lifted off my feet, my body folding upward onto the hood of the car. My head slammed against the windshield. The glass didn't shatter. It flexed with a deep thud, and a web of cracks instantly radiated from the point of impact. The force of it was immense, a white-hot explosion inside my skull. For a moment, I was looking up at the black, starless sky, pinned against the glass. Then the car braked. The sudden deceleration threw me forward, off the hood. I flew through the air for a second, a limp, broken doll. I landed on the asphalt with a heavy, wet slap. My left shoulder took the brunt of it, shattering with a sound I felt more than heard. My head hit the pavement a second time. And then, nothing. The music stopped. The light went out. Darkness. My eyes opened. The first thing I saw was the ceiling. White plaster, stained with a map of old water leaks. A single, bare bulb hung from a frayed cord. It was off. Gray daylight filtered through a grimy window to my right. I was on my back, on a mattress that sagged in the middle. The sheets were twisted around my legs, cool and slightly damp. I sat up. My body protested, a chorus of dull aches in my neck and back. My head pounded. But this was a different kind of pounding, the familiar, hungover kind. I swung my legs over the side of the bed. My bare feet touched a worn wooden floor. I looked around. The room. My room. A small table stood against the far wall, a dirty coffee mug and an overflowing ashtray on its surface. A cheap wooden chair was tucked underneath it. To the left, the door to the small bathroom was ajar. The main door, the one to the hallway, was closed and bolted. A half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey stood on the floor by the bed. I stared at it. The sight of it made my stomach turn. My hand went to my head. I ran my fingers through my hair. The events of the night before were a thick fog. The bar, yes. The long walk home. But after that, Nothing. A black hole. It didn't matter. It was always the same. 1 year, I mumbled. The words were a rough scrape in my dry throat. 1 fucking year. My eyes drifted to the wall beside the door. There was a small, framed photograph hanging there. It was cheap. The black plastic frame worth less than the nail it hung on. A picture of Sarah. Smiling. Taken on a beach somewhere. Years ago. Before everything. Her hair was blowing in the wind. She looked happy. It was my daily ritual, waking up to the dull ache of existence and looking at that picture. A reminder. The nail in the coffin of every new day. I looked at her face. At the smile I had erased, the guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The hit and run. The screech of tires that played in my sleep. The crunch of impact. Me, behind the wheel, running away like a coward. Leaving someone, leaving them on the road. I never knew who. I never went back. I never looked, I just ran. And I had been running ever since, right into this room. This tomb. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heels of my palms against them, as if I could physically push the memory away. The pounding in my skull intensified. I took a deep, shaky breath and let it out. When I opened my eyes, I looked back at the photograph. Something was off. I stared. My hungover brain struggled to process what it was seeing. It felt different. I blinked, trying to clear my vision. The frame was tilted. Just a little. Maybe a single degree to the left. The bottom right corner was higher than the bottom left. It wasn't straight anymore. It had been straight yesterday. I was sure of it. I was obsessive about it. It was the one thing in this whole wreck of a room that was always perfectly level. I checked it. Every morning. But now, it was crooked. A cold prickle ran up my arms. I stood up, my knees cracking. I walked over to the wall, my eyes locked on the picture. It was definitely tilted. A small, insignificant, impossible change. I reached out a trembling finger to straighten it, and the loop began again.